Welcome everyone to our breakout session on using Gen AI tools for research. I'm honored to have this session with Marinka Zitnik and Kiante Brantley from HMS and SAINS. I'm Max Shad, Senior Director of AI ML Research Engineering at Kempner Institute. If you are not familiar with Kempner, it's a new, almost like 3 years now, under Office of President and Provost. It's a faculty initiative focusing on the study of natural and artificial intelligence. And for this session, we are going through different parts. It was hard to curate materials for this session, use of Gen AI tools for research. People also do research on Gen AI and they use tools for that purpose. So we divided the session. I will start from you, what tools you are using for what purpose. So you can learn from you as well, what are the tools that you are using. And then I will go through some of the Gen AI tools frameworks that can help you for your specific use case and research. And then we will hear from Marinka and Kiante on their use of foundational models, Gen AI, in their specific research area. All right. So Marinka, she is associate faculty at Harvard Medical School, Biomedical Informatics. She joined Harvard 5 years ago. Before that, she was a postdoc at Stanford in computer science and also a member of Chan Zuckerberg's Creative BioHub, and also associate faculty at Kempner Institute. Also, Kiante, assistant professor of computer science. We will hear from him how he's using these Gen AI tools in his research. He's also Institute Investigator at Kempner Institute. And before joining Harvard in June of last year, he was a postdoc at Cornell in computer science. All right, so this is an interactive slide. We would like to hear from you. If you scan the barcode with your phone, just let us know what kind of Gen AI tool or framework have you used in your research. So it's the word cloud, as people are adding. If you enter the same word, it's just going to become bigger and bigger, and you can take a screenshot if you want to see what a small sample of Harvard researchers, staff, faculty, students are using, what tools they are using for their research. All right, not surprising, ChatGPT. DeepSeek, Perplexity, here. You can either scan the barcode or just add that URL and the code to access the Slido. I think the results are interesting. I mean, it's not a surprise that ChatGPT almost first. Hugging Face, people used to upload their open source model data, and the researchers pull those models, those data in their research. Notebook LM by Google, you can upload documents and try to chat with them. You can have multiple documents. And feel free to take a screenshot if you want to just keep it as a sample of tools that people are using at Harvard. Great. And then we want to know how you are using these tools, for what purpose. So now in this slide, just like few words, what is your main use cases? And you can enter multiple here. A lot of summarizing. Feel free to take a snapshot if you want to know how people are using these tools. Data analysis has a big contribution here. Learning and the way you prompt to learn a complex topic, it really helps you go step by step. And people are creative creating those prompts to give them, let's say, examples, sometimes with code, with Jupyter Notebook. And now they are like, I know about ChatGPT Pro version. It also runs the code if in a sandbox if it doesn't have complex library to try some idea and shows you the results. So they are becoming smarter and smarter. And coding, software engineering, editing. So there are a lot of use cases and there are a lot of tools. If you want to take a photo before moving to the next slide, feel free. So I try to find few tools other than ChatGPT, how people are using. There are a lot of use cases for each. I try to put just few for each. And I haven't tested most of these. I try to do some search in different resources, how people are using it. I have tried ChatGPT Perplexity for some literature review. It gives you all the resources. The one that has concepts, this one is a GPT in the ChatGPT, especially trained on the literature, like scientific literature. And it's a long list. It's a never-ending list. And I'm not sure how many of you have tried anything other than ChatGPT, just to get a sense. Almost, that's more than 80% of the room. This is great. And I try to get some stats by looking into how researchers in different fields are using it. There are many resources. It's hard to vet the reliability. I look at some Nature blogs that came 2 years ago, and then with a difference few months in February and later in September. There is an article in Technology and Society which also discusses the challenges of using these tools in research. What are the advantages and disadvantages? That was pretty good paper going through that, and also from the research firm, discussing in the biomedical research and trying to extract the numbers and putting together what is the percentage of researchers in different fields using these tools, and just put together what are the major fields, the areas and the fields. And the medical and health sciences was slightly lower, maybe because of ethical and more restriction. And also the way these surveys are being done, each they use a different methodology, so it's hard to generalize. But that was interesting, different sources. The lowest was from the medical. So we can hear later from Marinka if there are any regulation in the medical fields that prevents students from using it. And also, I try to look into different sources, like the first Nature blog post in February 23. That was 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago. I look at the percentage of participants around 500. Less than 10% on that time used these generative AI every day. And then most people either never used it or just tried out of interest, but not regularly. And the use case, other than just trying to have fun with these tools, was brainstorm research ideas and then to write code. And different reasons that they listed here. Then a few months later, they did another survey with more participants, this time 1,600 from different regions, right? Asia, Europe, North America. And also, they divided participants into the ones that use AI in research. They didn't use AI in research, and also the ones that study AI. So before going into the use cases, they showed that just use of AI and ML terms in the title and abstract skyrocketed like in the last few years. Not just in computer science. The first one is the top one is the computer science, but then in like social sciences, in health and medicine and different fields, and which is very interesting. Like people in the field that are not used to these tools, now they are using these titles, like these terms in their publication. And few months later, like in September, now coding came first. And there was also a post, if I'm recalling right, in Harvard Business Review, how people are using Gen AI, just in general, not in research. First one was like brainstorming, like ideas. This year, it was more like using as a therapy and consultation. That was an interesting blog post that shows how general public are using these tools. And I was trying to introduce few tools which are curated toward like Harvard researchers. It was hard to come up with few tools that can be applied to most people. You will hear from Marinka and Kiante on their specific domains. But for me, I was trying to come up with some tools that anyone trying to work on these models or application of these models can use these tools. So I came up with few code bases workflows that my team developed since last year at Kempner, and they are open source. They are on our Institute GitHub, and everyone can use it. And I try to focus on the tools that are curated for Harvard researchers that you can run on the clusters at Harvard, because every research computing centers, they have like computing resources, and the way that you run the job, the way it orchestrates and schedules your job might be different outside the university, let's say in companies, and inside Harvard. And these code-based tools are curated specifically for researchers at FASCs, HMS, and also Kempner AI cluster. I'll go over few of them, and then there are QR code if you're interested to, save them for later use, or if you are interested to explore more or get in touch, happy to discuss them for your use cases. So when we are talking about like Gen AI, there are, everyone keeps saying LLM is a specific form of generative AI, focus on the language, right? But also when we say foundational models, Gen AI, the foundational models are trained on a large set of data. They can do multiple tasks. And most of the researchers, when they want to study, data size in some cases might be large, or the model might be large, and you want to train these models, you want to fine-tune these models. It doesn't fit into one accelerator. At Harvard, we are using GPU. You heard about number of GPUs at Harvard. I think it was like around 1,500 and more coming this year. And in order to use these tools, you need to know all the complexity of running, deploying these models, training at the scales. And these are not the skills that you would expect a person in a different field, not in computer science or engineering, be able to master. But there are like workflows that you can just use them to, for your specific application without going deep. But just in general, you can have a model that fits in one GPU, but then there are more data set to train on. So in order to accelerate your training, you can consider fitting this model in one GPU, but using 10,000s of GPUs and fit each GPU with different data. We call it data parallel in the for a specific form of parallelism. Or in some cases, let's say you want to study this largest Llama 3.1 405B model that doesn't fit into one GPU. You can use different form of parallelism and try to shard the model with different techniques and have the model in different GPUs and then do training or inference. And the tools I'm introducing, most of them use some sort of parallelism, but it doesn't require deep knowledge of them if you want to use them for your research. So the first one is NeMo. There are a lot of libraries that evolve in that space, but it's hard to find one that encapsulates most of these use cases. Let's say you want to do pre-training a smaller model, not like a large model, even like 300 million or 1B models. Let's say you want to do fine-tuning a model using LoRa, QLoRa techniques. You want to do inference. And NVIDIA came with different tools. Now, NeMo covers most of the libraries into one, like a full stack framework for Gen AI research. And underlying structure, you can find different libraries that help you to build the model, customize it, deploy it, and do inference on these models. It covers different form of parallelism, covers multi-GPU, easy to do experiment with them, and also produce research. And as I mentioned, it uses different libraries in the backend and helps to have all these workflows in one ecosystem. And we are investing a lot on this work, NeMo, to build and workflows and make researcher life easier if they want to experiment and build, customize, and deploy this model. So one of the workflows, two of my team members, they work on creating a workflow tuned for Harvard clusters, people at FAS, HMS, and also Kempner cluster. Very similar Slurm-based architecture. They can use this to do pre-training, fine-tuning, and also do RL on that, on those clusters. It's a Slurm-based workflow. It uses Singularity. Like basically, it's a container. Instead of like dealing with the dependency on the cluster, you can just package them into a container that deals with the dependency and easy to share with your collaborator or within the lab. And there's a QR code on each page. You can feel free to save it. They are open source and also available on Kempner GitHub. And then some people study language model. So they may just try to study AI, the behavior of large language models for different aspects, or just use this for their own research. Someone is trying to not just use for text, maybe for different form of input, tokenize different form of input, or try to experiment with the language models. Allen Institute for AI, AI2, they released this open source language model last year in February 24. It allows you to, it's open source. You can access all the training scripts, do hyperparameter search. It covers scaling. You can run it on multi-GPU, change number of parameters in your model, build a small model, build larger model. We tried pretty like over 100 GPUs and scale it on our cluster. Easy to experiment, and since it's open source, you can integrate in your workflows. If you are trying to do some data processing, fit it to this language model, take the output and do some evaluation, you can build a pipeline specific for your research. And we build a workflow specific to Harvard clusters, a Slurm-based, and you can access those scripts in your GitHub. But then some people found it a little bit challenging to go deep into the code and understand how language model works. So Naeem, my team, he removed all the complexity of these models and made it single GPU. So it's a mean Olmo, a minimalist version of Olmo, which just runs on one GPU, and he changed the code structure easier for researchers to understand. So it's more on the research code base. Anyone wants to understand how a language model works, try to run smaller examples and make a pipeline. You can use mean Olmo for that purpose. And then we decided to go from scratch, just write a transformer research code base from scratch and use components in our research. Because we started with Olmo and then made mean Olmo. But then for other research, we wanted to have access to different components and customize it, both as a learning path and also as an open source tool. We just started from scratch, build a decoder-based model, which also covers different form of parallelism, data parallel and fully sharded data parallel, and already integrated in different research code bases. So you can also consider another transformer research code base developed at Harvard. It runs smoothly on Harvard clusters, single GPU, multiple GPU, and we are doing active development on this tool. You can also contribute to this tool, to any tool that I show. Open like a pull request on GitHub, contribute, add feature or request feature, and people will be happy to help you on this. So these are for training, but sometimes you just want to get the model and deploy on their cluster. There are like Hugging Face libraries to do that. We use VLLM. VLLM supports distributed inference. Let's say you want to experiment with a 405 billion parameter, Llama 3.1. It doesn't fit into one H100 GPU, which has 80 gigabyte of memory in our case. So we built a distributed inference workflow on these language models, and it runs on FAS HMS cluster. And you can experiment with different models. And we are already using this for different research. One good use case is a lot of people are doing reasoning with language models. So you can consider, imagine like running these models and doing like post training, like test time scaling with these models and doing reasoning. And at the end, we came up with the open source computing handbook. This is accessible to the public, and everyone can contribute. It covers several research code bases, workflows that we made open source, and also other than AI workflow, it covers some neuro AI workflow. People are working on, let's say, spike sorting. There's like a distributed spike sorting algorithm that people workflow that people can deploy in Harvard clusters. So it's tailored for our cluster, and you can use it. That map shows different countries accessing the computing handbook, and we are glad that it's a growing resource for researchers. And I think I only have a minute left, so I can pass it to Marinka. As I said, Marinka, Associate Professor of Biomedical Informatics, and we will hear from the AI research.
Hi. Okay, hello everyone. Really a pleasure to be here with you today and share some of our research on how we can empower biomedical discovery with new Gen AI and related tools. So I'll highlight very briefly a few projects that we have in the group and how they have enabled new biomedical research. So we have already seen and heard from Max on how generative AI is changing the way scientists and researchers go about their everyday work. We're also interested in leveraging and developing AI models that can help augment research, and particularly providing insights that might not have been possible with more traditional deep learning models just a few years ago. And so as part of that, we're developing models that are able of increasingly performing skeptical learning and reasoning by integrating multimodal experimental data together with experimental platforms, with the overall vision that eventually we'll have models that can learn and innovate on their own. And so that is helpful because it can help and generate new scientific hypotheses, generate research plans. Those research plans are then sent to our experimental collaborators who can validate predictions made by those models experimentally. And those models can work with other humans or in a collaborative manner or with other individuals for continual innovation. On the other side, we are very interested in developing and leveraging these AI scientist models for the purpose of informing medical and clinical research, particularly informing design of clinical trials, identifying biomarkers that can help us understand the response to treatments at the individual patient level, and do that across many diseases and many patient populations. So under the AI scientist paradigm, our group is developing models that operate at 3 key scales of biology. Those three scales include modeling molecules and with the goal of understanding what molecules, proteins in particular, what they do, what their role or function is across broad range of biological contexts. When we go one scale up, we look at the function of molecules and proteins in the context of cellular environments by developing models for cellular and multicellular predictions. And finally, going all the way to understanding therapies in the context of patient populations. So let me share with you two vignettes, one that operates at the molecular and then therapeutic level. So as a field of AI for science, there's been just tremendous amount of advances over the last several years. And we now have models that are able to really predict the structure, the shape of molecules by looking at the amino acid sequences, these linear chains of amino acid sequences alone. That there will be tremendous breakthroughs in the ability and of those models that can predict protein structure very accurately from amino acid sequence, and do that at the level of accuracy that often match experimental accuracy. And sometimes these predictive models can be used as drop-in replacement of experimental structures, which is a fantastic achievement that also received a Nobel Prize this last cycle. A grand challenge that remains open is how we can understand what those proteins do. What are their roles? What are their functions? Can we predict functions from their sequence and structure? That largely remains an open challenge, but it would be fantastic to have models that would be able to take any of the human protein and then produce information and insight about what is the role and function of those proteins. You can imagine that having that insight can inform many aspects of molecular biology research. We would want to do that because large number of human proteins are dark proteins. We don't really know what they do. Over 95% of publications in life sciences focus on 5,000 most well-studied human proteins. Then the richness of functional notation of proteins correlates with funding cycles. In retrospect, that's not surprising. But we would love to have models that would be more comprehensively be able to predict functions across a broad range of human proteins. So in response to this grand challenge, we developed a model. We refer to it as Procyon model that we're very fortunate to be able to train on the Kempner AI cluster. Once Procyon is trained, it is a model that users can interact with by prompting the model. So it establishes a conversational approach to human protein biology in similar ways as you can converse with ChatGPT or DeepSeek and ask questions about everyday topics. But here we are interested in protein biology specifically. So human scientists can come to Procyon, describe their biological function or task of interest, and then ask Procyon to retrieve proteins from the database that likely would have the biological function they are studying. Or they can engage in a question answering game with the model about the protein of their interest. Or they can use the model in a generative sense, meaning that they provide a protein of interest and they ask the models to generate captions or phenotypic descriptions. Similarly, as many models, some of which you might have interacted with, they can take an image of cats or dogs and then generate captions for those images. We're doing that, but not for images of cats and dogs, but instead for structures and sequences of proteins where the model can generate these phenotypic descriptions that are candidate predicted functions and roles that proteins would have in human cells. How did we train such a model? To train a model, we built a large training data set we call Procyon Instruct Tuning data set. It's a data set of 33 million data points that contains information about protein sequences, their predicted, as well as experimentally derived structures, and very broad descriptions of phenotypic characterizations that cover 5 knowledge domains from biological functions, disease mechanisms, therapeutic mechanisms of actions, protein domains, functional substructural units of proteins, and molecular interactions. And we couple that with information that comes from a large-scale literature reading by reading scientific papers for natural language understanding. As I mentioned, we were fortunate to be able to access Kempner AI cluster and then also train this model for extended period of time over a large number of GPUs in order to finally produce a model that is a Procyon multi-model foundation model for predicting protein functions. Let me share with you some of the key capabilities that Procyon has And in particular, I will focus on a few vignettes that show how the model can be used for addressing tasks that we could not easily address with prior techniques developed in this field. So in one biological application, we were interested in identifying peptide molecules. So these are, think of them as very short proteins with roughly 20 to 50 amino acids long. And we wanted to identify those peptides that would likely bind a specific target of interest, which in our case was ACE2 enzyme. And so we asked Procyon if it can identify what are peptides that likely would bind ACE2 enzyme. And so after developing, fine-tuning Procyon further to develop Procyon binds that can predict and identify peptides that are predicted to likely bind to ACE2, we send those lists of peptide molecules to our collaborators and experimentalists and ask them to see whether they can take peptides sequences produced by Procyon, starting at those that are ranked at the very top of the prediction list, and then go and synthesize those molecules. So our collaborators have built over many years 3D printer devices when they can go to the lab and then they can take the amino acid sequences of molecules predicted by Procyon. You will see how they can print in and enter the amino acid sequence, and they press the generate button, and this will happen, and they will generate those molecules. And they generated those molecules based on Procyon predictions and produced for us this experimental data set that when we then compared against Procyon predictions to see and confirm that those peptides predicted by the model as having higher binding scores for ACE2 were indeed experimentally also enriched for peptides with better binding profiles for ACE2. In another biological application, we used Procyon to identify where on the shape of the proteins drugs, when they enter human body and they bind to target proteins, where exactly does that binding occur? In particular, we wanted to understand for proteins that have multiple substructural units called protein domains, which are those domains that small molecule drugs bind to exert their therapeutic effect. And so very easily, with no additional adaptation and tuning, human scientists then described the small molecule drug of interest, in this case miglitol, and they asked Procyon to produce a ranked list of protein domains that are predicted to bind to miglitol by Procyon. And then we checked whether those domains at the very top of the list are indeed drug-binding protein domains. And the answer to that was positive, and it was positive not just for MGMA2 protein, but for a number of other protein and drug pairs. Finally, because the model is multimodal, meaning that it combines together natural language descriptions to make it easily interfaceable with humans, with understanding of the structure, atom-level representations of molecules and the sequence, we can start associating these free-form textual descriptions of functions with elements of protein structure and sequence. So we explored this feature in the context of PSEN1 and PSEN2 proteins that are very well studied proteins in the context of Alzheimer's disease. And we wanted to start understanding how introducing specific point-wise mutations in the amino acid sequence would change predictions that Procyon made about the functions of those proteins. So in the first prompt here, users specified wild-type sequence of the protein, and then they asked Procyon to predict the functions for that wild-type sequence, and then they start slowly introducing mutations at the different positions in the protein and see how that changes predicted functions. And in doing so, we can start linking phenotypes of functions to specific locations in the structure sequence that might be responsible for it. Ultimately, the main motivation for this project was the ability to generate phenotypic descriptions across proteins that have empty functional pages and are poorly functionally characterized. So for several thousands of proteins like that have empty pages in reference databases in science, such as Swiss Prot, UniProt, and others, we generated such protein cards. Here's an example of one generated for AKN81, where the input prompt to Procyon was AKN81 sequence and predicted structure, because experimental structure does not exist yet. And Procyon was asked to generate phenotypic descriptions that it can be generated in conditional manner, prompted in different ways. And then we can take those phenotypic descriptions and those that are predicted as highly confident by the model, we can engage in downstream work, exploring and validating them. So here we worked with a group by Emma Landberg, where we looked at human protein atlas information to explore the prediction around the formation of actin cytoskeleton made by Procyon for AKNAD1. So this really now provides a tool that more universally can provide functional insight across the entire range of human proteins. We can then take many proteins that previously were dark proteins with no functional annotations, and then annotate them with Procyon. And then we have another model called Atomica that can model those proteins at the atom levels scale, and then generate hypotheses that our collaborators are testing experimentally, provide results that fit into retraining of the model to enable this multi-step continual learning and improvement over time. Okay, so very briefly, there's just one more thing I'd like to share. So we looked at the molecular scale. Let's look a bit at the level of therapeutics or patient scale. And so here we are developing agent models, not this type of agents, these kind of types of agents. So most recently, that's just a few weeks old model that we released called TX Agent, which is the first AI reasoning model for reasoning about drugs. And the beauty and the advantage of that approach is that this model, it's not solely multimodal, but it knows how to use tools. And so over the last several years, there's been tremendous amount of innovation in training small models and large language models. And now we're in this era where it's very exciting to think about models that can know how to use tools. What does that mean? These models can autonomously go and decide to use an API and retrieve information from reputable, verified, trusted resource, or write some code and execute the code, or query a machine learning model, etc. So TX Agent is a model of that kind. It can reason across all drugs developed since 1939 and validated clinical insights. And the way this is possible is because this agent uses over 211 tools. Those are all tools from OpenFDA, OpenTarget that contains clinically validated research insights, and Monarch Initiative for phenotypic reasoning. And so because of that, the model has the ability then to engage in multi-step inference. So when it is tasked with a more complex problem to solve, it will solve it not in one shot, but instead decompose it into simpler tasks and try to solve each of the simpler tasks to then arrive at the final answer. And it can perform surprisingly well. It can perform very well, even when it is compared to very recent models. So I'll skip some of the details because we're running short of time. Just show here an example how we benchmarked TX Agent against the DeepSeek R1, which was one of the recent models that some of you are using that you mentioned here. And we benchmarked it against a much larger model of 671 billion parameters for the purpose of identifying characterizing capability of how well the model can perform reasoning about the usage of drugs across precise patient populations for complex cases where patient might have comorbid diseases, take multiple drugs at the same time. And so it's challenging to decide what would optimal treatment plan be for a patient. So what we are seeing here is that because the model uses tools, it's much more grounded and hallucinates less than some of other models, such as R1 in this case, where during the multi-step inference process, at certain step, it will diverge from the optimal path, and then it's never able to recover. But in the context of TX Agent, each step in the reasoning process is grounded in verified, trusted resources. So this model can use tools, and we show that this is helpful for the model that can perform better than what we can do by simply prompting an LLM. And the idea of engaging in multi-step inference and performing and decomposing large tasks into smaller, more manageable tasks is also helpful for the model to produce more insightful predictions. So the work that we pursue in the group relates to open data sets, open models. we release a collection of models on how to Hugging Face to related data and code repositories. And we very much welcome collaborations with experimental clinical partners and other scientists. So I'll just stop here, and very happy to take perhaps questions after the session, and appreciate being here with you today.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Kiante Brantley. I'm assistant professor in computer science. And today I'll talk to you about post-training language models with reinforcement learning. Lining language models one reward at a time. So a large language model is a deep learning model trained on a massive text data to understand and generate human language. And so for most of my PhD and even my research now, I'm interested in a very simple question. How does different objectives shape language models' behavior? And so in this talk, I'll walk you through what do I mean by this, and I'll talk about a couple of tools that I typically use, and I'll give you high-level insight about a thread of research that my group is working on. So ChatGPT is like a tool that we all use and we're all familiar with, and as we've seen from Max earlier, that like it's really popular among us. So this tool, the big innovation in this tool is this idea called reinforcement learning from human feedback. And so the high-level sketch of reinforcement learning from human feedback looks like, first, we'll have some supervised fine-tuning. We'll do supervised fine-tuning. We were given some data, which consists of prompts and desired generations. And we'll optimize this objective called the negative likelihood. And then from there, we'll take that model and we'll give it prompts. We'll have it generate multiple responses, and we'll have humans rank them. And with those rankings, we'll sort of train a preference reward model with this, or a preference reward function. And then from there, we'll take that model, that supervised fine-tune model, and this preference reward model that we learned, and we'll optimize it, which is with this objective function that I'm showing here. There's a rewards function that we got from step 2, my number's a little off, minus this KL constraint where we don't want to deviate too far from this supervised fine-tune model that we trained. And then so what happened was that this plot I'm showing is from an OpenAI paper from 2022. And what the plot is showing is that if we do supervised fine-tuning, and we can compare that to all the other models that we could have trained, so pre-trained and RL fine-tuning, the human learning rate is a lot higher for models that you train with RL. So in particular, how do they do this? So you take the supervised fine-tuned model, that in particular is 175B, and you have all your other models of different model scales. You give both of them prompts, they'll generate, and you'll have a human rank which one is better. And so what this plot is showing is that RL, even with the smallest model, outperforms pre-training and supervised fine-tuning. Right? And this was this big breakthrough that sort of unlocked the capability of ChatGPT. And so again, there's this big surge in reasoning language models. And so I'm taking a quote from OpenAI's blog. It says, we are introducing OpenAI 01, a new language model trained with reinforcement learning to perform complex reasoning. And so this new wave of models, what we're taking advantage of is this idea of test time compute. So instead of having a model given a prompt, generate an answer, you give the model a prompt and it generates a bunch of reasoning tokens and then it produces an answer. And that capability of it to generate a bunch of reasoning tokens and give you an answer was unlocked by doing reinforcement learning. So for people who haven't seen reinforcement learning, let's go through the basics so you can give it some intuition about how this framework works. So in RL, we have an environment. This environment, typically you can think of, you first have sort of this like initial prompt. So like you prompt the model with something. And then in this environment, you can take actions. And actions we can think of as being just words in our vocabularies. And this environment has state. So our state is just composed of either our prompt or our previous actions concatenated with the current action that we just took. Right? So it means that in like state two is just state one concatenated with our previous word we just generated, which is roads, so forth and so forth. And also in this environment, you have a transition function. The transition function takes in a state, an action, maps you to a new state. You also have a reward function. The reward function takes in the state and gives you a score of how good it is to be in that particular state. And you have an horizon. The horizon is set to H, is just the max generation length that a model could sort of generate. And so with this environment, now we have an agent. And that agent interacts in the environment by taking actions. And the environment passes back to that agent a new state based on the action that it took. The environment also passes back a reward, which is based on the previous state and the current action that the agent took. And the goal here is to learn an agent to maximize the reward. But there's this like subtle issue, right? Like this framework is nice, but if you actually want to train an agent into this framework, there's a bunch of complications that arises. Right? So one is that our reward is actually a model itself. Like, so it's a large language model that's giving us scores of how well it is to be in a state in action. Our agent is not just one model. Our agent is two models. Right? And I'll give you some intuition of why our agent is two models. So the first model is an actor. Basically, it takes in a state and it produces an action. The second model is a critic. The critic is saying, how good is it to be in a particular state, right? So if our critic is very good, then it can guide our actor to be in good states. If our critic is very bad, then our actor will be very bad. So you want your critic and actor to be good to optimize your agent in the environment. But the catch is that we need three models around, right? Typically, if you do supervised fine-tuning or pre-training, you just have one. And we have three here. And we could have more. My reward model, maybe two models. It could do three models. My actor could be more complicated than just two models. So there's this complicated pipeline that we have here. We actually want to do RL to optimize language models. And so the problem here is like, how can we efficiently coordinate models and manage GPU resources with fine-tuning language models with RL? And so these are like two big tools that I use in my research. One is VRL and one is OpenRLHF. And these are sort of efficient RL frameworks to train language models. And so the thing that they do for us is that there's this like complicated pipeline, right? The first step is like you have this generation stage where you have a prompt, you have your actor model, you get a response, your actor model gives you logits, and you have this reference model and critic model, reward model. All this information has to be stored in a buffer. And once you get this information in a buffer, you have the learning stage. So you take this information and your actor model gives you take the logits, you get the ratio, you compute the advantage, you get the loss. You have your critic model, gives you a new value. You clip it so your critic model doesn't deviate too far and you get a loss. Right? There's this really intense data flow of managing data and managing communication across these models. And these open source frameworks exist to allow us to do reinforcement learning on top and not have to think about these complications. And so typically in my group, we take advantage of one or two of these tools in order to do our research. So the question is like what can we build with these tools? And can I go back to answer my original question of like, how does different objective functions have an effect on language models' behavior? So remember, the goal of RL is to learn an agent to maximize the reward. But in RL, like rewards can be sparse or delayed. You have this exploration versus exploitation trade-off. You have credit assignment problems. You have sample efficiency problems. Like the list of problems run on. If you ever try to train an agent in RL versus a simple task or a very complex task like training a language model, then you know that you run into tons of issues. And so in particular in the language setting, in order to develop better algorithms, better objective functions to optimize these language models, I'm going to build inspiration from a classic hard problem that we used to have in the RL domain. And I'm going to give you some intuition around it. So has anyone ever played Montezuma's Revenge? Okay. So Monsters and Revenge, the environment is like imagine if you're an agent and you know nothing, and I drop you in Monsters and Revenge, I'm like, solve the game, right? The reward is super sparse. Like, there's so many ways to die. You could just jump off the ledge. If you go down the ladder and you don't jump across the rope properly, like, there are many ways to die, right? And the catch in this game is that when you die, you get a reward of 0. So you get nothing for, like, even getting close to a goal and not getting, right? So this is a very challenging problem. This is a sparse reward problem. And there were, like, tons of people trying to attack this in the RL space before language models. So it's like a very hard problem for us. And so in particular, like, imagine if the agent was like very close to getting a reward, and the reward is like kind of getting the key for like the first stage. So like it goes down the ladder, it jumps across the rope, goes down the ladder, it avoids the skull, it comes up the ladder, and it's like, you know, the agent is going to get the reward. But instead, it like goes right. And you're like, oh wait, hold up. The key is left. So the agent goes right. It falls off the ledge, it gets a 0. So like, this is extremely like sparse reward problem. Exploration is hard. And it like got to the ledge, fell off, got a reward of 0, and that whole trajectory is just wasted, right? But like, we know that there was some good information in that decision that it was making, and we would like to sort of take advantage of that. How can we do it? So imagine if the agent was here, right? And so like, there's there's 2 classic papers. One is called Go Explore. The other is called Learning Monsters and Revenge from a Single Demonstration. And the key intuition, which is really cool, is that in these video games, their environment is deterministic and resettable, right? Meaning that if the agent got really close, got here, and it died, I can reset to this state. Now, I'm not going to tell you how I decide on the states I want to reset to, but let's assume for a moment we have a good way of deciding how we want to reset. And I can reset my agent back to the state, and then like it can explore a bit and not die and maybe get the key. So one reasonable way of how you want to reset is to like have some expert play the game, use their demonstration data of like them playing the game, and just reset it along the traces in which they've done. Does it make sense? Right. So we're just gonna like reset using some expert demonstration data, and that can help us solve this hard exploration problem. So the question is very simple. Like, if that helped us solve this like very hard problem, Monsters and Revenge, like how can we use resets to train language models for to train language models more efficiently with RL? So reset, let me walk you through this reset property in language models. So reset is going to allow us to roll a policy out with partial sentences. So what do I mean by this? So it's going to allow us to like inject data sources into the experience collection process, right? So when we typically train language models in RL, we have a prompt, we'll generate a response. So we'll sample a prompt from our data, we'll sample a response from this model, and we'll get a reward for this. Now, because our transition function is deterministic, similar to the game setting, then we can just reset. I mean, resetting in the language setting is just deleting words that you generated. That's like pretty straightforward to do, right? And then I can sample alternative completions and score that alternative of continuation. And so now if I look at my generation, I have this thing called a roll in and this thing called a roll out. So this is very interesting. So my roll in distribution is like helping me find good states to learn on, and my roll out distribution is scoring those initial states. So let me give you some intuition of like what my roll in and roll out distribution could be. So my roll in distribution could be, imagine I have a prompt and I have a very hard math problem. I could roll into like partial completions, meaning like I could take partial lemmas from a theorem that was proved and use those, add them to my prompt, and generate a completion from that. So my roll in distribution can come from expert demonstration data, and then my policy can learn on top of that. And like I said, the roll in and roll out can be different. So I have a collection of papers along this thread built on this intuition. I'm not going to go into like the details of them, but the high level intuition for the first one is like roll in and roll out schemes invoke different behaviors, different algorithms. And these different algorithms have kind of different theoretical guarantees, but also different empirical performance. So, for example, you can imagine if my rollout policy is like an optimal policy, then I can always just use that for scoring. Like you can imagine like if my policy generates partial traces, partial completions, and I have a human just like write the remaining parts. Like if it goes off a bit or it generates something bad, you can have a human generate the extra part. Or I have a larger model that performs really well, it can sort of help guide a smaller model. And you can swap the roles. Now, if my roll-in policy is really good, I can just take demonstration data from an expert and roll out with my policy to learn on. And so this paper kind of studies these different roll-in and roll-out schemes, and we kind of give some theoretical guarantees, and we have some practical performance. And so the second paper is like dataset reset policy optimization, kind of builds on this general framework and focuses on the particular pattern that gave us the best performance. And we have this last algorithm called REBEL, reinforcement learning regressing relative rewards. And so here, the thing that we want to take advantage of here is that like the previous papers are helping us with exploration, but this paper is really helping us reduce the computational overhead of having all of these models in the GPU that we talked about earlier in the talk. And so I'll give like just a little teaser at some results that we got. So this is fine-tuning Meta's 8B model for a general chat. On the left, I'm showing the Meta model before we trained it with our algorithm. On the right is GPT-4 performance. And we can see that this intuition of using rollouts, this intuition of using resets is very helpful for training models at scale. And so I'll conclude with so how do we use resets to train language models more efficiently in ORL? Like those three papers roughly kind of look something like this. Like resets with reference policy can help boost exploration. Resetting with demonstration data can help boost exploration. And resetting with the current policy can help sort of reduce computational overhead. And with that, I'll acknowledge my collaborators and I'll take any questions.